Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Traci Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're catching this episode. If you listen, thank you so much. If you watch, thank you so much. If you're catching this on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. And I think there's still a notification bell that you can click so that you're notified when new episodes or videos, in this case on YouTube, are published. And for those of you who watch or listen on Spotify, you can kind of do the same thing. You can get notified when a new episode drops. So before I get into this episode, I just want to issue a trigger warning that we will be talking about death and loneliness and isolation. And if those topics are topics that you are uncomfortable with or that trigger you or that you just simply don't have the emotional bandwidth to kind of take part in, that is totally okay. You can skip this episode. I will not be upset with you. I get it. So I just want to mention that I'm going to talk about this topic in a few different ways. There was recently an employee at Wells Fargo who was found at her desk 4 days after she presumably passed. And I'll dive into this. I'll share her name and all of that. But that is kind of the overarching topic here is this particular employee of Wells Fargo. And then I'm going to talk about this situation in a couple different ways. One, the obvious, which is like, how did 4 days pass before someone even noticed? And two, how is this tied to the isolation potentially that people might feel in a remote environment or in what might be a hybrid environment? I just can't understand how someone was not found. But anyway, so I'm going to talk about it in a few different ways. By no means am I using her passing as an excuse to talk about these things. I just want to be abundantly clear. I do think that there are just undertones here that maybe allow us to dive into what we could be doing differently in order to ensure that employee safety and well-being are paramount in our workplaces. So first and foremost, let me tell you a little bit about this situation. I actually just heard about this, actually, thanks to my my assistant, Julia. I unfortunately did not hear about this, and at the time that the news broke on September 2nd, and so she shared with me that this happened, and I'm reading all these articles, and it is pretty jarring. So Forbes released an article on September 2nd. I realized that this episode is going to come out fairly, a couple weeks after this date, but it's still relevant, of course. So the title of the article is "Why the Death of the Wells Fargo Employee Found at Work is So Jarring." And so this employee, Denise Rudeholm, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She was 60 years old. She scanned into a Wells Fargo office in Tempe, Arizona on August 16th and then never scanned out. She died at her desk and wasn't found until the following Tuesday. So 4 days had passed before she was found. And it seems that, there effectively someone was walking by and found her, a coworker. Wells Fargo did share that she sat in a less populated area of the office. But I have to say, first of all, I'm really sorry to hear that someone passed A, B at work, too, and C, that someone had to find her at work. That's just, it's all just bad, right? Like, no matter what way we fold this, it's unfortunate and it's tragic. And I can't help but wonder, did she have family that asked about her whereabouts? Did she not have a manager who was checking in? Did she not have friends or coworkers who were checking in. I think about my own experience, and by no means do I even want to compare. But every day I'm talking to a friend at work or a friend outside of work. I obviously am very connected to my family, and maybe not everyone has those networks, which is going to be something that we talk about when we talk about the potential isolation that some people feel at work, or just in general, especially post-COVID. And it's just really hard for me to put my mind or to like really put myself in this situation where I could imagine that no one like messaged her and like didn't notice that something was off. Like, let's say they use Teams messaging or Slack or whatever. Did anyone realize that she wasn't answering and that she wasn't on PTO? Like, it's just really hard for me to understand. But at the end of the day, I guess, Wells Fargo is a larger company. Maybe it is possible that no one noticed. This Forbes article continues on to talk about how employee safety has to be number one, and that employee safety is not just, making sure that people are safe, but that it's also thinking about people's experiences and, how employers really see each individual as a person and not just this collective like team or number, which is something that we've been talking about for years and years and years on this podcast, right? I want to read this one paragraph. I think it's interesting and an important one. So it goes on to say, what Rudeholm's death at her desk triggered is a stark reminder that life is short and raises the bigger question of whether we are wasting precious time working for large companies who, at the end of the day, don't notice if an employee dies at their desk for 4 days. In a year filled with headlines of tech layoffs where huge corporations continue to put profit over people and corporate America wrestles with return to office mandates that employees are outright rejecting, Rudeholm's death might be the event that pushes many to leave the rat race. Middle-aged women in particular are leaving the workforce in increasing numbers. Nearly 33% of women in the UK expect to leave the workforce before retirement for reasons other than their own personal choice. One contributing factor is businesses are under-equipped to meet the growing needs of older women in the workforce, and in particular, menopause. And menopause is actually a subject that I'm breaking away from the paragraph, by the way, is a subject that we will be talking about in a future episode. I have a guest who is going to join me who will kind of help me talk through menopause benefits for women in that, age category, but also, people who are just aging in general, right? Like, you don't have to be a woman going through menopause to have to think about, what would be next, right? Like pre-menopause, right? So I'm not going to jump too far off the topic bandwagon here, but that's something that I'm definitely going to save because we are going to talk about that at length, and maybe we can even bring this up since we haven't recorded yet. But this Forbes article continues on to say her experience highlights a stark truth that we really are just a number to the place where we spend the majority of our waking hours. The harsh reality is that we are spending our time and energy in the wrong place for the wrong people. For many, Rudeholm's death is a wake-up call to make changes while they still can, and that's a special legacy to leave. There's definitely truth there. There are definitely companies that see people as numbers and they don't care to individualize. But I also would like to think that companies do care about their employees and that there are managers and leaders who do care about their teams and their employees. And I would like to think that this is just kind of an unfortunate circumstance. And according to my research, there isn't any information that's showing that there was foul play. Like, at least their initial investigation is showing that they don't believe that there is foul play. So, while it says this is an NBC article, but it says the cause of death is pending determination by the Maricopa County medical examiner, but the preliminary investigation showed no obvious signs of foul play. So I I part of me really hopes that this is just, again, an unfortunate circumstance. But, for those of us who are employees and coworkers and friends, this is a reminder to check in on your people. And I don't know, maybe people did check in. Maybe people were like, maybe she's just taking the day off. Maybe she's really busy. Because the interesting thing is that it was a Friday into a weekend, right? So if assuming that no one's working over the weekend, maybe she was working a late night, maybe she didn't live with anyone, and there wasn't any thought about it. I don't know. It's just really, it is jarring. I think jarring is the right word. I'll link the articles that I've referenced, of course, in the show notes so you can read more. But I think, there's of course this tragedy on the cusp of this topic here. And then there's also what the author wrote in the Forbes article, that there's this potential dehumanization of people in the workplace, and that many people, as they wrote in the article, many older women are leaving the workforce, and that maybe making this change or thinking about where you work is a good idea and a good thing to think about now rather than later. I don't know. I know that sometimes I put on rose-colored glasses just generally, but I would really like to think that more people, more often than not, people are working for companies that do care about them, that do check in, that do know about their whereabouts. And it's certainly not an excuse for Wells Fargo, but I think if this is like a hybrid schedule, and maybe, there wasn't a meeting that she would have needed to attend until a later time in that week, like maybe it is possible for someone to be forgotten or to not have information on their whereabouts. But then I challenge that thinking, and I've had situations where I've had to do wellness checks on employees in the past. So at the same time, when I think about those moments, it was never after 24 hours. It was like someone didn't show up for a meeting, someone is not answering their phone or their Slack or their email or whatever, and we're worried. And it takes not that long of a time to get to that place of worry. So yeah, I would love to get some answers to this. Like, did she have meetings? Did her manager talk to HR about a wellness check? Did HR do a wellness check? Like, was there what happened here? And then also, I mean, it's evident based on what I've read that someone kind of just like stumbled upon her. So then it's like, how does Monday go by and then part of Tuesday go by and no one's asking where Denise is? So definitely concerning. And I would urge Wells Fargo to really think about how their leaders and how their people interact. I mean, if they're not meeting ever, like maybe this is just an example of where people just need to be more connected. So that's kind of the first thing. It's really hard to talk about something like this because there's a lot of assuming and just a lot of speculation. And I certainly don't want to do that, especially when we're talking about someone's life. Like, that's not the game I'm playing here. So without getting too far down this rabbit hole and creating all of these what ifs, I think let's leave it there and hope that people did check in and that people did raise a flag to the appropriate people, and that those appropriate people hopefully did the right thing and we're trying to track her down. And I don't know, but at the same time, I keep like playing devil's advocate with my own statements, but it's like you could see she scanned in and didn't scan out. So that doesn't take very long to figure out. I don't know. It's just not great. It's not great. So I don't want to speculate. I don't want to make assumptions. Let's move on to this next part of the topic, and just, sending my condolences to Denise's loved ones and her network and community. So the second kind of tenet to this conversation is around like loneliness and isolation in the workplace, which many unfortunately feel. There are a host of people who say that they don't enjoy remote work because they feel isolated, because they feel lonely. And there are a lot of people who don't feel that way, which is great. For those who feel lonely and isolated, they often seek out employment that requires them to be in the office, or at least in the office sometimes, or that has like a co-working agreement. I've seen that a lot too. So there is an HR Dive article. I've been featured on HR Dive a couple times. They're a great resource, a great like publication for HR topics and articles. So definitely check out the link in my show notes if you want to do deeper dives into other topics as well. So I want to read the beginning here because I think it does set up this topic and like subject matter pretty well. So it starts off by saying, since the COVID epidemic, actually, I think it was a pandemic. So since the COVID pandemic sent us all into lockdown more than 4 years ago, I've heard a common refrain that we all have never fully recovered from the isolation. It comes as a lighthearted joke sometimes in social settings when someone does something awkward, or on a Zoom call when we wave goodbye to our Brady Bunch-esque squares. Say that 5 times over. But there are heavier undertones to the sentiment. In many cases, our social circles are smaller. We work remotely. We have our groceries delivered. We ride silently in rideshare cars instead of taking public transit. Last year, the U.S. Surgeon General issued an advisory warning of the dangers of the epidemic of loneliness and isolation in the country, an increased risk for mental health challenges, heart disease, stroke, and of developing dementia for older adults. And then it continues on by saying a November a November Perceptics report found that more than 4 in 10 workers said they felt very or somewhat lonely at work. So the good news, it's not the majority, but the bad news is that it's 40%. One recent event brought into sharp focus just how heartbreaking this disconnect from one another can be. And then, of course, this is the story about Denise. Some of the headlines reporting her death touched on the themes of loneliness. And in a statement emailed to HR Dive, Wells Fargo said the company is committed to the safety and wellness of our workforce, and counselors are available to support any employees impacted by the event. So, of course, lonely. I think, first of all, actually, before I go into anything, I don't think it's fair to speculate that Denise's death had anything to do with loneliness or isolation. I do think it's fair to make the connection that not her being unfortunately dead at her cubicle for 4 days before being found accidentally, essentially, I do think it's fair to make the connection that because of a lack of connection to people, Wells Fargo employees, the leadership team there, failed to realize that one of their own was not alive. So that I think is fair. I don't think it's fair to draw a connection that she was lonely or that she was isolated or that she didn't have connections, because we don't know that to be true. And I certainly hope it's not true. Throughout my experience in HR, I've come to a profound realization. Certain tools can truly be a game changer. That's why I'm excited to talk about Cocoon, the leave management software that's making waves in the industry. I've heard wonderful things about how Cocoon not only simplifies the entire leave process, but also keeps administrative costs low. Their automation handles the most complex parts of leave, from compliance and claims to payroll, saving your team countless hours and headaches about leave. Clients and their finance teams rave about the cost savings they've seen by taking advantage of state and disability benefits for their employees. Plus, Cocoon integrates seamlessly with top HRIS systems like Workday and ADP, ensuring a smooth process from start to finish. Head to cocoon.com/HR and see the value for you and your employees. New customers who mention my podcast are eligible for a 50% implementation fee discount. Again, that's cocoon.com/HR, cocoon.com/HR. Now let's get back to the podcast. So we have to be really careful, again, not to speculate, and we have to be really careful not to jump to conclusions. It's very possible that there was some very unfortunate medical emergency that she had and she was alone. Now, this, of course, is a speculation also, but when we understand that her unfortunately not being found until 4 days later is a reflection of potentially the disconnect between employees and employers, and potentially the lack of connection that people once had in the office. Now, I also think, because I'm a big proponent of remote work, I also think that you can have a remote workforce that's deeply connected and doesn't feel lonely or isolated. Certainly there are people who hopefully they know themselves and know that remote work is not for them. It really is not for everyone, just like in-person work is not for everyone. I'm sorry, it's just not. There are people who really would rather be alone in a room and they'd get more work done, and maybe they talk to people every now and then, but maybe they don't need that. Maybe that's not what helps them to focus. I mean, we have to remember that people come from all types of like I should say like cognitive abilities. And, there are people who are neurodivergent. There are people who are not. Like everyone learns and works differently. And I don't think it's fair to say that in-person work is great for everyone or that remote work is great for everyone. You have to know yourself and you have to know which environment is best for you. And sometimes you learn that by doing the thing that you then realize is not right for you. With that, I think, understanding loneliness and isolation is critical for 40% of people surveyed in that Perceptics report. I can understand that. I mean, sure, if if I think about someone who lives alone in an apartment and they're working on Zoom and that's when they meet, and maybe they live in a state or a city where there are no colleagues around, I get that. I think this is where companies really have to know their people. Leaders have to listen to what their employees tell them. And maybe there's an opportunity to build into budgets for remote companies, co-working spaces or micro offices in specific cities. Like I could totally see if someone is like the only employee in one state that and there are others who are able to meet, that you give that person budget to go and work in a co-working space once a week or a couple times a month or maybe 3 days a week. I mean, who knows, right? So I could totally see that. I also think that, companies generally do a good job of fostering an environment where well-being is talked about and where resources are provided. I do believe that companies generally do an okay job with this. Of course, that doesn't absolve companies of the responsibility for sharing this information, for ensuring that employee assistance programs are offered, that they have contributions to wellness benefits and things like that. All of those things remain true, that companies have to, see the opportunity in that and see where committing to employees' well-being and mental health is a great move, not only for their employees' well-being, but also for business results, because the better people feel, the more connected people feel, the better the outcome will be. So if someone really doesn't want to do it just because it's the right thing to do, maybe they'll do it because it'll drive stronger performance. I don't know. I really hope that the former is more important, but we know how some of this stuff goes. So, certainly without boiling down someone's life to this concept or this statistical analysis, because I certainly don't want to do that, we can understand as HR leaders where we can continue to focus on employee well-being. I think, again, companies generally do a good job of this. I don't think that there's a company in 2024 that would say employee well-being doesn't matter to us or employee well-being isn't a priority. I really would like to think that most companies really care about their people and really care about the well-being of their employees. So if you work for a company where maybe there can be some improvement here, there's so many things that you can do. I mean, whether it's offering employee assistance programs, offering wellness benefits, checking in with your employees. Like if you're an HR leader, there are things that you can do directly, and there are things that you can encourage your leaders do to drive and foster connection and drive and foster, a focus on employee well-being. So that being said, I think that's probably the conclusion of our episode. Like I said, I don't want to go too deeply into the discussion on menopause and the impact on the workforce and all of that, because that's going to come up in a future episode. And I also, just because this particular person, Denise, was 60, I just don't feel comfortable speculating anything that this had to do with her age or her, choice or anything like that. Like, all we know is that the investigation so far has ruled out foul play, that she didn't scan out of the office, that someone found her 4 days after she presumably died. And now Wells Fargo is working to figure out what happened and is ensuring that her family is supported during this time. So this is what we know. We can only operate and talk about things based on the facts that we have in front of us. And I really do not like to speculate or jump to conclusions, but certainly we can draw some elements or underpinnings of this back to how are people checking in and being, feeling connected at work, and how do companies humanize their employees and their workforce, and then also how we ensure that loneliness and isolation is a thing of the past, and that we encourage employees to do what's best for them, and that we get connected with them, and that they feel supported in their mental health and their well-being, and that we invest in those things. So with that, of course, as I said, sending condolences to Denise's family and community. And for those of you who maybe have had to think a little bit about your own experiences in the way that you work, or where you want to work, you can, there's nothing holding you back from doing what's best for you. That's how I like to see life. If something is better for you, just do that something, rather than, doing what someone else wants you to do. So that said, I hope that these topics and I should say, like, characteristics or things that we could pull out, learnings that we could pull out from this situation, this unfortunate situation, have been helpful to you. And at the end of the day, if you or someone you know needs to talk, or maybe is in that bucket of feeling lonely or isolated, I will have resources in the show notes as well. And of course, reach out to me if you have any questions about this topic, or if you want me to talk about anything similar or different in the future. Happy to. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week. Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.